Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we discuss paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava, and this is the second half of my interview with Michael Huemer. So last week, I spoke to Michael Huemer about direct realism and skepticism, and now this second part of the discussion is going to be about ethical intuitionism. So this is mostly a new topic. I do recommend listening to the first part first, just because there's a couple of things that we sort of make reference to, but more or less this stands alone as a separate discussion. I do want to mention again, same thing as last week, that there are sort of quick moments where there's kind of a glitch in the audio and Michael unfortunately drops out. But for the most part, I think you can always still make out what he's saying. So I hope that won't be too much of a problem. And without further ado, here's the episode. Let me start by asking you to lay out some of the metaethical sort of options as you do at the beginning of your book, Ethical Intuitionism.
Yeah, so traditionally, you can be either a realist or an anti-realist, right? Realists think that there are objective moral facts or evaluative facts about what's good or bad or right or wrong. And anti-realists think that there aren't any objective moral facts or evaluative facts. Notice that these are exhaustive. These are the only two possibilities. If you're a realist, then traditionally you're either a naturalist or an intuitionist. If you're a naturalist, that means you think that, roughly speaking, that the evaluative facts can be explained in terms of non-evaluative facts. They can be reduced. And if you're an intuitionist, you think they cannot be reduced. Also, the naturalists usually think that we have empirical knowledge about the evaluative facts, and the intuitionists think that it's a priori knowledge. If you're an anti-realist, then you have three options. You could think, in asking sort of what's the status of a typical moral statement, like murder is wrong, you could think it's false. You could think it's neither true nor false, or you could think it's true, but its truth depends upon the attitudes of observers. Mm-hmm. And those are the only three possibilities, because if you don't think any of those, then you have to think that it's true and it's independent of the attitudes of observers. And that is, by definition, an objective moral fact.
Right.
So if you think that it's neither true nor false, so traditionally that's non-cognitivism. And the reason people would say that is they would think, when you say something is wrong, you're not really describing any purported fact about it. You're just like expressing your feelings, or you're just like trying to stop other people from doing the thing that you think is wrong. You're not really describing anything. And then there are the people who think that it's false, because they think when you say murder is wrong, you're attributing to it an objective moral property. And nothing has objective moral properties, so you must just be wrong. Mm-hmm. Right? And then there are the people who think, no, it's dependent on the attitudes of observers. So when you say murder is wrong, you might be saying something like society disapproves of murder, or you might be saying I disapprove of murder. And that can be true. Like, it's true that society disapproves of murder. It's also true that I disapprove of murder. So that's just going to make the statement true, but it won't be objective because it's dependent upon the attitudes of the observer.
Now, in your book, when you were laying this out, you say that what you just described is the traditional way of laying out the metaethical possibilities. But you propose an alternative taxonomy that you think more accurately gets at what the fundamental questions really are. Can you describe that?
Right. Yeah, so what I just said was the traditional way of taxonomizing. My preferred taxonomy would be, okay, you could be either a monist or a dualist. So the question is about the relationship between evaluative facts and descriptive facts. If you're a monist, that means you think there's only one kind of fact. There's only the descriptive facts. There's nobody who thinks there are only evaluative facts, right? So we don't have to talk about that. So there are people who think there are only descriptive facts, and then there are people who think there are two kinds of facts, which are irreducible to each other. There's the descriptive and the evaluative. So the dualists, there's one form of dualism. It's ethical intuitionism, which is my own view. Everybody else disagrees. And the reason why this is the fundamental division is that this is the ontological difference. See, the difference between the different monist views is semantic. The difference between ethical intuitionism and everyone else is ontological. Only the intuitionists think that there's a separate kind of fact over and above the descriptive facts about the world, namely the value facts. Everybody else thinks there's only the descriptive facts, and they just disagree about how those relate to our language. Right. So, yeah.
Now, you earlier said that you think there's this kind of dogmatic attitude towards physicalism and naturalism. Do you think that that's at play here as well? That maybe the reason why most people would reject something like ethical intuitionism is that they have a predisposition to reject any kinds of entities other than physical entities?
That's part of it, yeah. I mean, there are different motivations. I think there are a number of kind of not epistemically good motivations for why people don't like intuitionism. One of them is this sort of a scientific attitude, where it's roughly like people think, well, scientists don't talk about value, and that like doesn't appear in physics. So if you talk about that, you're being unscientific, and we don't like being unscientific, so we have to deny that exists, or something like that. Other epistemically bad attitudes are sometimes people think, oh, if you believe in objective moral fact, that means that you have to think, when cultures disagree upon what's right or wrong, some of them are wrong, right? And then won't that mean that you have to oppress other cultures because you think that their values are objectively wrong or something? Right? So these are all epistemically bad motivations. Now, anti-realists give arguments for their view, right? But I think that mostly what happens is people pick their view first, and then they pick which arguments they're persuaded by once they know what view they want to be persuaded of. Right? So, the main reason why people don't like intuitionism, like the most honest thing that people say is it's weird. Right? Like believing in facts over and above the physical facts is weird. And I think that that's a pretty accurate characterization of their actual reason. But I think that's a really bad reason. Like you shouldn't reject a view because it's weird.
Well, isn't it maybe a more charitable way of saying the same thing, that you should, something like Occam's razor, right? Like you should be more minimal, right? You should not accept, you should be let me put it this way, you should be very hesitant to accept new kinds of ontological entities because there's some kind of, there's some methodological imperative to keep your worldview as simple as you actually can while still accounting for the facts.
Right, yeah. Well, that last clause that you put in there is crucial, right? While still accounting for the facts.
Yeah.
So then the question is, what counts as the facts? And then why doesn't the wrongness of murder count as one of the facts that has to be accounted for, right? So, imagine somebody had the absurd view that nothing exists, right? Like nothing at all. And then you ask this person why they believe that, and they say, well, that's the simplest view, right? Because my view entails the existence of fewer entities than any other view. True or false, there's some reason to believe this, because in virtue of Occam's razor, right? Because it's the simplest view. I'm inclined to say no, there's no reason at all to believe this, right? The fact that this view entails fewer entities is not a reason to believe it, because it doesn't account for the things that we know. Or it doesn't account, you might say, it doesn't account for the foundational evidence, right? And in my view, well, the foundational propositions are the things that appear to us to be true, right? Things that directly appear to us to be true. So like the simplest theory that accounts for that is maybe the most likely to be true, right? Mm-hmm. So then you have the question of whether moral beliefs are foundational. But, on my general foundationalist view, it's pretty clear that moral beliefs can count as foundational, because a moral proposition can directly seem to you to be true, and and you can fail to have reasons for doubting it.
I see. So you would say that in the question of the existence of moral facts, that kind of burden shifting that we talked about with regard to epistemological skepticism applies here as well?
Right. Yeah. Right. So, like in my view, there's no good reason for trusting only some appearances prima facie and not others.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, I mean, or put it this way, you need a reason for, if you're going to accept some appearances and not others, you need a reason why some of them shouldn't be trusted. Like, you need positive grounds for doubt. And it's not the case that the person who thinks things are the way they appear has to give positive reasons for thinking them, right? And so if you're going to accept your sensory appearances, why not also accept your evaluative appearances, namely your ethical intuitions? And like, somebody needs to give a reason why you should accept only one of those and not the other.
Right. So it seems, so I want to just say intuitively that it just feels to me like, though I do have these direct ethical intuitions, they, right off the bat, there's something about them that seems like they should be a bit more open to doubt than my direct perceptual awareness. I think if I speculate as to why that might be, maybe I would say something like, it could be something like, there tends to be more disagreement about moral intuitions than about perceptual. So maybe if I was in a room with somebody and this person said, for whatever reason, for whatever like complicated philosophical reasons, I don't actually think that the murder is wrong. I might be kind of surprised, but I wouldn't be like utterly shocked. I'd be like, all right, let's see what you have to say. But if I was sitting in a room and that person said, I don't see a lamp in front of me, right? I would be like, you're either lying or like I need to take you somewhere.
Well, but so like seeing the lamp is like having the ethical intuition, right? So not seeing the lamp is like somebody who comes in and they say, murder seems fine to me, right? Like it's not like a person who has some complicated philosophical argument for why murder is wrong comes out false. It's a person who, when they see a murder, they have no reaction to it. Mm-hmm. And there are some people like that. They're called sociopaths, right? But also they're crazy. And, you might think that they're kind of analogous to schizophrenics who are hearing voices, right? Who are hallucinating all the time, right? So, there could be people who have those kind of cognitive defects. Okay, but, on the question of certainty, most intuitions are less certain than most perceptions, right? But so that's a reason why you should be less confident of most of your moral judgment than you are of most of your perceptual judgments. It's not really a reason why you should like completely give up on moral judgments, right? Right, and some moral judgments appear very certain. So it seems to me very clear that pain is bad. If somebody says, when I experience pains, I don't see anything bad about them, then I start to suspect maybe he's not experienced a pain. Like maybe this person doesn't actually know what a pain is.
Yeah. So I'd like to hear what is your okay, so we have to kind of account for the fact that we do have these strong ethical intuitions, and perhaps the simplest way, kind of taking a similar methodology as you did when you were considering the epistemological concern, the simplest thing is to assume that you are actually aware of moral facts. I suppose what you call a naturalist is going to have some account for why we have these intuitions, though they are not actually evaluative facts, though they are really just something that arises from just physical descriptive facts. What is like the most common or strongest account like that from naturalists?
Well, so uh, they might cite evolutionary psychology. They might cite your kind of cultural indoctrination. In some cases, your moral beliefs are explained by idiosyncratic biases of yours, right? But the thing is, like, the mistake that's being made here, I think, is the same as the mistake that the indirect realists and the skeptics are making. So, like, the indirect realist and the skeptic think that the data that you start with is your sensory experiences, and then you have to give the best explanation of that. And then you wind up having to explain why the brain in that scenario isn't a good explanation, and that's really hard, and you might wind up being a skeptic. Okay, and the same thing happens with moral intuitions. If you think that you have to explain you're having an intuition, then you get these alternative explanations that are hard to refute, right? And then you might wind up being a moral skeptic. Okay? But the response in the perceptual case is, no, the data isn't that I have sensory experiences. The data is the facts about the physical world that I'm directly observing. And in the case of moral philosophy, the data that we start with is the moral facts that I appear to be observing or intuiting. Right? So, like, skeptical scenarios don't explain the directly observed physical facts, and they don't explain the directly observed moral facts either. Right? So, like, you have to explain the badness of pain and the wrongness of murder and things like that.
When it comes to moral facts, I have a really strong inclination to ask, what sort of things are these? Like, what are they actually? What are their characteristics, and what is their source? What do they really come from? In a way that actually, when you explain direct realism to me, I don't really feel that inclination. I don't want to say, like, what are these real world objects? So I'm actually sort of observing that I have that different inclination, but I still actually want to ask the question, like, what can you characterize what these things are?
Well, there are facts about good, bad, right, and wrong, and stuff like that. There are facts that are sort of inherently positive or negative, and there's no explanation that doesn't involve some term like that, like good, bad, positive, or negative, right? Because by definition, these are evaluative facts that we're talking about, not descriptive facts, right? So I can't give you any explanation that doesn't use evaluative terms in the explanation, right? Now, you might feel like this is unsatisfactory or you don't have a grip on it, but in fact, I think this happens all the time in philosophy. When you get to a fundamental level and you ask what is such and such, it just happens very frequently that there's nothing that can be said. So if you ask, like, well, what's the nature of time? At some point you just, like, can't really explain it, right?
Yeah.
Or, if you ask about qualia, so ask about what it's like to see blue, you can't really explain that further. Right? And somebody says, well, just tell me, like, the general nature of these qualia facts. You can sort of vaguely describe it, but you can't say anything very helpful. Right? You can give examples of it. So I could give examples of moral facts also, but I can't give you, like, a general theory that's very helpful.
So that makes sense, and I understand that you need these kinds of foundational, like, primitives in philosophy to start talking about certain kinds of things. When it comes to moral facts, in some sense, I'm tempted to accept them, but I want to tell you what my instinct is to say, and I wonder whether you think that this is consistent with ethical intuitionism, or whether this is something more like some version of reductionism. I want to say that it seems like moral facts have a source to them, that they're not quite primitive, and that source is something like the facts about what tends to make human beings be well. And we could, I guess, spell that out in different ways. Maybe not feel pain, since pain is more immediate. Maybe it makes more sense to define it in terms of pain, or maybe it makes more sense to define it in terms of happiness. But that based on the way that human beings are, there are certain kinds of actions that will tend to make humans be overall better off, and certain kinds of actions that will make human beings not be better off, and that and that the essentially the evolutionary process and the fact that collaboration between people and coordination between people has tended to be good for the survival of the species. The evolutionary process has provided for these these intuitions that make us feel like we really like it's a fact that we should do this type of thing. That to me seems like, I guess it depends on, I guess there it gets a little complicated based on your ontology, but I'm kind of okay calling those moral facts, though they seem to me to have a source to them. They don't seem quite foundational in that way that, say, qualia is.
Right. Well, so whether moral facts have a source might depend upon which moral facts you're talking about. So there could be a reason why freedom is valuable. It could be because it helps people pursue their goals. And that could be good because usually pursuing their goals makes them better off. So, but suppose that you ask, why is it better for people to be better off? Why care about human welfare? And why try to make it so that there's more, so that people are better off rather than worse off? Is there a source of that? So I don't see what it could be, right? But also, I guess I don't see why we would think that there is a source of that, right? So that is a source of the fact that it's better to make people better off rather than worse off.
What about the kind of evolutionary picture? So generally, maybe, let's say that generally being well off, however you want to cash that out, will facilitate certain kinds of activities that will be conducive to the survival of the species, and so evolutionary imperatives will provide for that kind of an intuition that it's good for people to be better off.
Yes. Well, so are we trying to explain why we should try to make people better off? Or are we trying to explain why people believe that they should try to make people better off? Right. So citing facts about evolution doesn't explain why anybody should do anything. Like, evolution can give explanations of why the human species is the way it is, why people have the traits they have, including their psychological traits. It could, in some cases, maybe explain why we have some of the beliefs we have, but it's not going to explain any moral facts, right? And also, if somebody asks, well, can you explain why you should produce benefits rather than harms? I kind of think this is not really a legitimate question. I don't think that calls for explanation. I think it's self-evident that it's better to produce benefits than harms. Right now, by the way, you might kind of wonder whether benefit and harm are themselves evaluative terms, in which case it might be analytic that you should produce benefits, okay? Well, it's not really clear. The concept benefit is maybe in between a descriptive and an evaluative concept, right? But you can sort of, you can clearly draw a connection from descriptive and evaluative facts. If you point to the self-evident truth that being happier, having more enjoyment and less pain makes you better off. So I think that's self-evident. It's also self-evident that other things being equal, you should produce benefits rather than harms. So then you can get at the theorem, if you will, that other things being equal, it's better to make people happier rather than causing suffering. And so I don't think, it doesn't strike me that the premises of this called for explanation. It doesn't strike me intuitively that we need an explanation for why pain counts as a harm, nor that we need an explanation for why you should prefer benefits over harms.
Yeah. I mean, you're totally right that looking for an evolutionary explanation is merely describing why why people would believe this, but not at all for why this would actually be the case. And certainly what you're describing in terms of these premises, if you accept your sort of that burden shifting sort of methodology that we've talked about throughout this conversation, that makes sense. Now, I still have this sort of, I'm just sort of noticing that I still have this sort of intuition to question, to want to question evaluative assumptions in a way that was less the case with perception. And that's not necessarily an objection. It's something that I'm going to think about and see what I come to. But I wonder whether you've encountered this before, and if you have any thoughts about why it might be hard for people to feel differently about just accepting ethical intuitions as just appearances, in the way that maybe it's not as hard for them to accept other kinds of appearances.
Yeah, well, ethical facts are more abstract, right? And most people have a firmer grip on concrete facts rather than abstract facts. Mm-hmm. We can invoke Plato here and say that people are trapped in the cave, the sensory appearances that we have are typically stronger, if you will. Like, there are appearances that usually strike you with very little ambiguity, and they're very firm. So you get a high degree of confidence. As opposed to more intellectual appearances. And, then this probably has to do with the fact that our intellectual faculties evolved more recently, and they're more sophisticated, and they require more brain power than just the perceptual faculties, right? So, I see the fact that it's harder to disbelieve in physical facts than it is to disbelieve in moral facts. There are more people who doubt moral facts and who doubt physical facts, right? But they're having different degrees of certainty isn't really a principal difference, right? So you might be less confident of moral facts, but that doesn't mean that you should be completely skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Right. Hey, so we're just about out of time. I want to ask you one more question, and it is about, so you told me that you have a book coming out called Paradox Lost, which, as I mentioned to you, really struck me because that was actually a title I considered for this podcast. But since paradoxes are a really just interesting topic generally for me, I'm curious if you could just kind of give a quick pitch for what this book is going to be about.
Well, I solved 10 philosophical paradoxes. So some of them, I think, do not have any good solution previously, this book. Of course, other people would disagree with me on that. All right, but so the liar paradox is in there, which is related to your puzzle about who shaves the barber.
Right.
And the Sorites paradox is in there, and Newcomb's paradox. There's the Sleeping Beauty problem, and the Raven's paradox, and several others that I've forgotten right now. Right, but in each case, I explain the paradox. In most cases, I explain why I don't accept some other solutions, and then I try to give the correct solution. So I hope that what happens is you feel confused when I explain the paradox, and then when I give the solution, you feel like it fell into place. So if everything goes according to plan, then you'll feel enlightened and have a greater understanding. If not, then you might think that I have some crazy ideas.
I have to ask, are the Liar and Sorites in the category that you think were unsolved before?
Sort of, yeah. So the Liar paradox, there are solutions that are kind of close to what I say, but I don't think that anybody got it quite right. The Sorites paradox, so I think my basic view, some people have held. So my basic view is that the sentences in the Sorites argument fail to express propositions. Some people have said that. They haven't given the explanation that I gave. Okay, so I think I have a better, kind of more detailed account of what's going on and why they fail to express propositions.
Interesting. Wow, okay. And you mentioned Newcomb's. You got to open both boxes, right?
Yeah, take both.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
Yeah.
All right, Michael, thank you so much. This has been a really awesome discussion. I really appreciate you joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.